The mess hall at Joint Operating Base Ironwood roared with its usual symphony of aluminum trays scraping against metal runners, crude jokes bouncing off cinder block walls, and the perpetual diesel rumble bleeding in from the motor pool outside. Soldiers shuffled through like tired cattle, collecting their portions of mystery meat and overcooked vegetables, filling the space with the kind of resigned energy that comes from eating the same meal for the 100th time. Near the far wall, tucked away from the tribal clusters of infantry grunts and supply NCOs, sat Chief Warrant Officer Elena Torres, 36 years old, 5'2" on a generous day. Dark hair wound into a regulation bun so tight it could withstand a sandstorm. She hunched over a ruggedized laptop, fingers dancing across encrypted relay protocols while she mechanically forked bland rice into her mouth. She didn't look up, didn't engage, didn't exist to most of the room. She was furniture. Background noise in a uniform. Then Master Sergeant Tyler Graves walked in. He moved like a man who believed the world owed him attention, shoulders wide enough to block doorways, voice loud enough to drown out generators. Behind him trailed Sergeant First Class Ramirez and Staff Sergeant Chen, his personal chorus of enablers who laughed at his jokes before he finished telling them. The trio swept through the mess hall like a storm front nobody asked for, and their eyes locked onto Elena's isolated table with the precision of predators spotting wounded prey. "Well, well," Graves announced, his voice cutting through conversations like a chainsaw through kindling. "If it isn't our resident tech wizard. Tell me, Chief, you conjure those radio signals with a magic wand, or just by sitting real quiet and hoping nobody notices you?" A few nearby tables glanced over. Some soldiers grinned nervously, unsure whether this was friendly banter or something darker. Elena didn't look up. She saved her file, closed one window, opened another. Graves stepped closer, his shadow falling across her screen like an oil spill. "I'm talking to you, Torres. Or are you too busy pretending to be important?" Ramirez snickered. Chen shifted his weight, eyes scanning the room to see who was watching. "Chief Nobody," Graves continued, leaning in until his forearm rested on the edge of her table. "That's what they should call you. A warrant officer who probably couldn't pass a basic rifle qual if her life depended on it. Playing soldier while the real warriors do the heavy lifting." Elena's jaw didn't tighten, her shoulders didn't hunch. She simply continued chewing, swallowed, and took a deliberate sip of water. Then, with the same measured calm she brought to debugging corrupted satellite uplinks, she closed her laptop, placed both hands flat on the table, and stood. Graves's grin widened. He thought he'd won. Elena picked up her tray, walked 3 steps toward the disposal station, and that's when Graves made his mistake. His hand shot out, slapping the tray from her grip. Food exploded across the floor in a grotesque Jackson Pollock of gravy and green beans. The mess hall went silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock, but the kind that comes from witnessing a line being crossed in front of 100 witnesses. Elena stopped, looked at the mess, looked at Graves. Her expression didn't shift, didn't harden, didn't reveal a single flicker of emotion. She turned, walked past him without a word, and exited through the side door. Her footsteps were even, unhurried, controlled. Behind her, Graves smirked at his audience, arms spread like a conquering hero. A few nervous laughs scattered across the room, but most people just stared at their trays, suddenly fascinated by cold mashed potatoes. Because deep down, even the ones who didn't know Elena well could feel it. That wasn't submission they'd just witnessed. That was restraint, and restraint, in the hands of someone truly dangerous, is far more terrifying than rage. Elena Torres existed in a world most people at Ironwood didn't understand. While infantry guys measured their days in kilometers marched and rounds fired, while admin clerks counted hours until the next supply run, Elena measured hers in milliseconds of latency, encrypted frequency bands, and the invisible architecture that kept an entire base connected to command, drones, air support, and each other. Officially, she was a signals intelligence officer on loan from the Navy to integrate a new tactical communications framework, a system so bleeding edge that half the Marines on base thought it was witchcraft, and the other half didn't care as long as their radios worked. In reality, Elena was the reason their radios worked. She was the unseen hand that stitched together satellite uplinks, drone feeds, ground unit transmissions, and fire support coordination into one living, breathing network. When a convoy's distress call cut through crystal clear instead of dissolving into static, that was her. When close air support received targeting data 3 seconds faster than expected, that was her. When enemy jamming attempts failed inexplicably, leaving hostile forces blind and confused, that was absolutely her. She moved through the operations center and server rooms with a rhythm that felt choreographed but wasn't. Tablet pressed to her chest like a shield, steps light and deliberate, eyes performing constant microscans of her environment. Corners checked, exits noted, personnel assessed and cataloged without a single obvious glance. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit, the kind drilled into someone who'd spent years operating in environments where inattention meant death. Her posture confused people. She didn't walk with the rigid, shoulders back march of a boot trying to impress a drill sergeant. She didn't slouch or shuffle like someone trying to disappear. She simply moved with economy, taking up exactly as much space as necessary and not a molecule more. When someone bumped into her in a crowded hallway, she didn't stumble or snap. She pivoted, letting the momentum slide past her like water around a stone. Her hands remained steady, whether typing code at 3 in the morning or holding scalding coffee during a base-wide power failure that sent everyone else into a panic. To the infantry NCOs rotating through the talk, she was just the quiet Navy chick who never raised her voice. To younger soldiers, she looked like someone who belonged in a cubicle stateside, not sharing a perimeter with mortars and concertina wire. Her size didn't help. 5 foot nothing, they muttered behind her back, as if the extra foot of height they had somehow translated into extra courage or competence. Senior leadership was split. Some respected her work because their missions depended on it. Others saw only her branch and specialty and filed her under support, not combat. To them, she was a necessary function, not a warrior. She was the IT person you called when something broke, not someone you'd want beside you when things went sideways. They were catastrophically wrong. But they had no way of knowing that yet. Rumors, of course, tried to fill in the blanks. They always do on bases like Ironwood, where boredom breeds speculation faster than the desert breeds scorpions. Someone swore they'd heard her name mentioned by a SEAL during a joint training op in Djibouti. Someone else claimed she'd once stepped off a Black Hawk with a team wearing plate carriers and war paint, then disappeared into the talk without a word. Heard she came from the teams, one logistics sergeant whispered in the smoke pit, voice heavy with the gravity of someone repeating a state secret. The thing about rumors is they need fuel. Elena gave them nothing. She never confirmed, never corrected, never engaged. When a curious comms specialist tried prying, asking if she'd ever worked with any special operations units, she glanced up from her terminal, blinked once, and said, "I serve where I'm needed." Then she went back to adjusting signal gain on a malfunctioning relay node. The conversation died there. Her quarters reflected the same discipline she carried everywhere else. A narrow rack with hospital corners. One spare uniform folded with creases sharp enough to draw blood. Boots aligned perfectly beneath the bunk. A small metal desk supporting a laptop, spiral notebook, and single coffee mug. No posters, no clutter, no pile of snack wrappers or contraband energy drinks. The order itself felt like decoration. On that desk, beneath the notebook, lay a hand-drawn frequency map. Hopping patterns, fallback bands, contingency channels for when atmospheric conditions twisted transmissions into static nightmares. She updated it during odd hours, pencil tapping softly against the metal desk as she thought through worst-case scenarios. To anyone else, it looked like lines and numbers. To Elena, it was a lifeline for people who didn't even know they needed one yet. There were only 2 hints in that room that her life had ever been anything else. One was a faded 550 cord bracelet resting on the edge of her nightstand, its weave worn smooth by salt water and time. The other was a small fabric patch tucked inside a drawer, folded over so the design wasn't fully visible. But the edges showed enough, the outline of a trident and something like a rising wave. No one had ever seen it. She made damn sure of that. Her habits off duty carried the same precision. Before sunrise, when the sky over Ironwood was still bruised purple and the air cool enough to breathe without tasting dust, Elena walked to the base natatorium. She always arrived with the towel over one shoulder, hair braided tight, face unreadable. The lifeguard on duty learned quickly that she didn't come to splash around or socialize. She came to work. She moved through the water in clean, silent lines, barely disturbing the surface. Long, controlled strokes. Breath held far longer than seemed comfortable. Turns executed with mechanical precision. Sometimes she sank to the bottom and just stayed there, knees folded, eyes open, motionless except for the slow rise of bubbles from her nose. When she surfaced, there was no gasp, no theatrical heave for air. Just one measured inhale, two blinks, then back to the wall for another lap. It wasn't exercise. It was calibration. Later, she'd sit alone in the dimly lit signals bay, the glow from monitors painting faint lines across her face. Her eyes tracked interference maps, searching for patterns in the noise. Where others saw chaos on the screen, she saw intent. Enemy operators testing ranges. Civilian chatter bleeding onto military bands. A storm rolling in from the east, chewing at signal margins. She adjusted gains, shifted bands, rerouted traffic, logged every change with meticulous precision. Her entire day was built from these quiet acts of control. Control of airwaves, control of breath, control of reaction. What nobody could see from the outside was why she clung to control so fiercely. Somewhere in her memory lived nights when control had slipped, when chaos had taken someone she cared about and left nothing but silence and salt water. The scar on her shoulder knew that story. The patch in her drawer knew it too. Watching her from across a room, you might not think twice. You might see only a small, quiet warrant officer who kept to herself and cared more about antenna angles than camaraderie. You might think she was harmless. Sometimes the most dangerous people look the quietest. The days after the mess hall incident didn't explode. They eroded. On the surface, life at Ironwood continued its usual grind. Convoys rolled out through the gates at dawn, kicking up rooster tails of dust. Helicopters beat the air into submission over the LZ. Briefings came and went. But underneath that routine, something else was happening. Master Sergeant Tyler Graves had decided the mess hall wasn't the end. In his mind, Elena's silence wasn't strength. It was defiance. A challenge. And he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from challenges, especially from someone he'd already decided was beneath him. The first escalation came in a hallway near the armory. Concrete walls, exposed conduit, flickering fluorescent lights that hummed like dying insects. Elena walked down it with her tablet tucked under one arm, eyes scanning a maintenance log. Ramirez and Chen leaned against the wall halfway down, pretending to review something on a clipboard. Graves stepped out from a side corridor just as she reached them, blocking her path completely. "Hey, Chief," he said, voice pitched just loud enough to draw attention from a passing fire team. "Sleep okay after your little tantrum in the mess hall? Or do warrant officers cry themselves to sleep in machine code?" Ramirez snorted. Chen grinned, without looking up from the clipboard. The fire team slowed, curiosity tugging at their boots like gravity. Elena stopped, her toes inches from Graves' boots. She looked at him once, eyes steady and unreadable, then at the narrow gap between his shoulder and the wall. She adjusted her angle, stepped smoothly around him without a word, and kept walking. Behind her, laughter rolled down the corridor. It followed her like bad feedback on a comms net. Back in her quarters that night, she did what she always did. Sat at her desk, opened an encrypted file, and added a new entry. Date, time, location, names, summary. She documented that Graves, Ramirez, and Chen had obstructed her movement in Corridor C7 at 1400 hours and made derogatory remarks referencing her competence and value as a service member. When she finished, she didn't stare at the screen in anger. She simply saved the entry and closed the laptop. It wasn't sentiment, it was evidence. Another day, another setting. The Tactical Operations Center this time. Radios crackled, screens glowed with map overlays and drone feeds. A massive topographical chart dominated one wall, dotted with unit markers and mission objectives. Elena stood near the communications rack, checking signal strength on a newly installed relay node. A low buzz of conversation filled the room as a rifle platoon prepped for a night patrol. Graves walked in with Ramirez and Chen flanking him. All three wore full battle rattle, plate carriers loaded with magazines, helmets clipped to their vests, rifles slung across their chests. Every inch of them screamed combat ready. They moved straight to the comms table where Elena was working. "Tech clerk," Graves announced, dropping his gloves on the table so they landed next to her hand. "Tell me something. When the bullets start flying, You gonna come out from behind that laptop? Or just send strongly worded emails to the enemy? A few soldiers chuckled, eyes darting between Graves and Elena, trying to read the room. Elena finished adjusting a dial, logged the change, then stepped half a pace back and turned to face him. Her expression didn't shift. Your radios will be operational for the duration of your patrol, she said calmly. If you experience signal loss, call it in on the backup band and we'll correct it. Graves rolled his eyes theatrically, glancing at his audience. Hear that? Half soldier, half software patch. Better hope the enemy respects your coding skills more than your courage. This time the laughter was thinner. Not gone, but edged with something else. A couple of younger soldiers glanced at Elena, then back at Graves, as if trying to gauge whether this was funny or just cruel. Elena didn't answer. She simply returned to her terminal, typed in a few final entries, then moved to the next console. Later, in her encrypted log, she documented the encounter with the same clinical precision. Her file grew entry by entry. No opinions, no adjectives. Just facts. Just evidence. The insults evolved over the following days. In the gym, where Elena performed quiet core work and stretching in a corner, Ramirez walked past with a pair of buddies and said loudly, "Careful, guys, that one probably has a kill count." In Call of Duty. Chen followed with, "Yeah, man, virtual tour of duty," halfway to a participation trophy. At the mailroom, when Elena picked up a small package containing replacement encryption cards, Chen stepped directly in front of her and said, "Ladies first," but didn't move. She stopped, waited, eyes on his face. Didn't sidestep until he finally chuckled and shifted just enough for her to pass. On the surface, each incident looked small. A joke, a tease, a playful nudge just under the threshold of actionable misconduct. That was the danger. Alone, they were easy to dismiss. Together, they formed a pattern. And Elena saw patterns for a living. Between system checks and pool laps, she started paying closer attention to where these encounters happened. Hallway angles. Camera placements. The way Graves liked to position himself with a wall at his back and his men flanking him, turning his body into both a physical blockade and a stage. During a late-night shift in the signals bay, she pulled up the base's internal security camera layout under the guise of troubleshooting interference near the motor pool. While adjusting bandwidth allocations, she mapped the blind spots. Corners where coverage overlapped poorly. Corridors where cameras had been repositioned for maintenance and never properly realigned. She didn't avoid those places. That would have been another form of surrender. Instead, she began accounting for them. Like weather, like terrain, the base population's behavior shifted slowly. On day one, in the mess hall, laughter came easily. People at nearby tables chuckled, not because they hated Elena, but because it felt like the safe choice. Graves was loud, confident, radiating the aura of someone who'd done hard things in hard places. Elena was quiet, small, alone. It felt natural to side with the louder one, even passively. But silence carries weight when repeated. The more Elena refused to bite back, the more that weight accumulated. She didn't give them an outburst to mock. She didn't offer tears or anger they could wave away as too sensitive. There was only calm, only the image of a warrant officer absorbing each push without bending. In the hallway outside the armory, when Graves called her a SEAL reject within earshot of two supply sergeants, their laughter died faster. One looked away, suddenly fascinated by a clipboard that didn't require that much attention. The other managed a stiff smile that never reached his eyes. In the TOC, after the half-soldier comment, a captain at the far end of the room glanced over sharply, then returned to his maps without saying anything. Small reactions, but real. Even Ramirez and Chen began showing hairline cracks. There were moments when Ramirez's grin slipped, as if he wasn't entirely comfortable with the direction this had taken. Chen, who never seemed fully confident to begin with, started glancing over his shoulder after they walked away from her, like he expected someone to call them back and demand accountability. Graves, though, only dug deeper. Her calm felt like defiance to him. He was the kind of man who needed reactions to feel powerful. Without them, his dominance felt incomplete. Every time Elena walked away without a word, it added fuel to a fire he didn't know how to extinguish. He started timing encounters to maximize attention. Right after shift changes, in doorways where foot traffic was heaviest, near the coffee urn in the TOC, where everyone eventually migrated. If he could turn the entire base into an audience, maybe her silence would finally crack under the weight of all those eyes. It never did. One evening, as the sun burned low and the sky turned the color of old bruises, Elena walked past a cluster of soldiers gathered near the motor pool. Graves spotted her and raised his voice without missing a beat in whatever story he was telling. "Ask the chief here," he said, gesturing at her with theatrical flair. "She knows all about pretending to be something you're not. Elite operator one day, tech clerk the next. Must be nice having the system protect your feelings." Ramirez gave a thin laugh. Chen chuckled too loudly. A couple of mechanics looked from Graves to Elena and back again. The silence that followed his words didn't feel like agreement. It felt heavy, uneasy. Elena paused just long enough to acknowledge all of them were there. Her gaze swept across the group, steady and unhurried. Then she kept walking, footsteps measured, shoulders relaxed. That night, another entry went into her encrypted log. Motor pool, time, names. Exact wording about pretending to be something you're not. From the outside, it looked like she was simply documenting harassment. Inside, something else was forming. A prosecution case building line by line. It was around this time that people at Ironwood began noticing small things about Elena. Things that didn't fit the neat box Graves tried to force her into. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just subtle details that seemed out of place for a quiet signals intelligence warrant officer. The first clue appeared in the doorway of the talk. A junior specialist pushed past her too quickly, trying to catch up with his squad. Anyone else would have stumbled or jerked back. Elena didn't. She pivoted smoothly, letting the momentum wash past her, body rotating just enough to avoid impact by millimeters. She didn't waver, didn't lose balance. It looked practiced. The kind of movement you don't learn in a classroom. Later, when she reached for a tool in a server cabinet, a technician beside her paused and stared at her hand. On her right thumb, just above the base, was a roughened strip of hardened skin. A callus. But not from typing, not from tools. The shape was wrong. It was long and angled. More like something you'd see on someone who'd spent years gripping and regripping a dive knife in saltwater environments. The tech didn't ask. He just blinked and pretended he hadn't noticed. In hallways, Elena checked corners the way some people breathed. Subtle. Natural. Barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Not paranoid. Not dramatic. Just a quick flick of her gaze toward blind angles before stepping through. Most people passed her without catching the motion. A few didn't. They whispered about it later, voices uncertain, like people who aren't sure if what they saw was unusual or a sign of something deeper. The strange part was that none of these habits matched her current job. Signals intelligence required precision, patience, analytical thinking. But not this. Not reflexes tuned like someone who'd been tested in environments far less forgiving than concrete hallways and air-conditioned server bays. Then came the night at the dive training facility. Elena always swam early mornings when the pool was almost empty. But that night, long after most of the base had turned in, she slipped into the dimly lit natatorium. The overhead lights were set to red for night training protocols, casting the entire space in a quiet, crimson haze. The water was still, reflecting metal beams and catwalks above. She walked to the edge with deliberate calm, placed a rebreather unit beside her feet, and dipped her toes into the frigid water. A single staff sergeant on watch sat in the control booth above, sipping terrible coffee and scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up when he heard the splash. Elena moved through the pool like a shadow, silent, slow, precise. She adjusted rebreather straps, checked gauges with calm fingers, took one long breath, and slipped beneath the surface. She didn't swim. She descended to the bottom, knees folding beneath her into a cross-legged position. Down there, under red lights and 12 feet of cold water, Elena became a statue. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then 2. The staff sergeant frowned. He stood, walked to the glass, wiped condensation away with his sleeve, and squinted. She was still down there, completely motionless. Hands resting on her thighs, head tilted slightly upward as bubbles escaped in slow, measured pulses. 3 minutes. 4. The sergeant leaned closer, breath fogging the glass. 5 minutes. 6. When Elena finally rose, she didn't burst to the surface, gasping. She ascended, slowly, controlled, like surfacing from a memory rather than water. Her head broke the surface in silence. One calm inhale, no drama, no strain. The staff sergeant exhaled in disbelief. Who the hell taught her to do that? He muttered to nobody. Elena pulled herself out of the water unhurried, droplets running down her arms. She dried off, packed her gear, and left without once acknowledging she'd been watched. The sergeant sat back in his chair, staring at the pool, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing. Word drifted across Ironwood in fragments. A corporal mentioned seeing her pivot out of an impact like she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times. A tech whispered about the strange callus on her hand. A mechanic swore he saw her check a corner like a breacher, not a comms officer. None of the pieces made sense alone. Together, they formed a shape nobody could name. One person didn't find the mystery intriguing. He found it threatening. Graves noticed everything. Not because he respected her, but because bullies pay attention to reactions they failed to provoke. Every ignored insult, every calm look, every quiet walk away. To him, her silence wasn't just refusal, it was defiance. A challenge twisting under his skin like a splinter. When he heard the rumor about her staying underwater for nearly 7 minutes, he didn't laugh it off like Ramirez tried to. He didn't dismiss it like Chen. He just grew very still, jaw tightening, before forcing a grin back onto his face. He didn't like questions without answers, and Elena Torres was starting to become nothing but questions, so he decided the next move had to be his. But not in hallways where cameras watched, not in rooms where soldiers passed through. If he was going to break her silence, he'd need a place the system couldn't see. The wind died down by the time Elena stepped out of the signals bay that night. Ironwood usually slept lightly, generators humming, distant vehicles rumbling, a few late shift personnel walking perimeter. But tonight felt quieter, cooler. A stillness hung over the base like the pause between heartbeats. Elena walked with her tablet secured, hands free, boots striking a steady rhythm on concrete. Her route wasn't random. It never was. She took the long way toward her quarters, weaving through the maintenance wing where metal walls amplified footsteps and overhead lights flickered unevenly. The air smelled faintly of diesel and dust. Then she turned down a narrow corridor she'd mapped days earlier. Bare metal walls, stacked supply crates, and most importantly, a blind spot in camera coverage. She didn't avoid it. She chose it. She knew Graves's pattern by now. Escalation wasn't a question. It was a clock ticking. And she preferred that clock on her terms. Her footsteps echoed softly. She passed the halfway mark. That's when she heard it. The scrape of boots behind her. The low murmur of voices ahead. She didn't speed up, didn't slow down. She just exhaled through her nose, long and controlled, and kept walking. 3 shapes stepped out from shadows at the corridor's far end. Graves at center, Ramirez left, Chen right. A sloppy triangle formation. Not tactical, just crowding. Well, look who's out past curfew, Graves said, voice stretching into mock friendliness. Chief Torres, the ghost of the TOC. Ramirez grinned. Maybe she's here to decrypt a mop bucket. Chen chuckled nervously, eyes darting to walls as if expecting someone else to appear. Elena said nothing. Her footsteps slowed to a stop exactly where she wanted them, just short of Graves's reach, but close enough to draw the next move. We were just talking, Graves said, stepping forward, blocking the path with his shoulder. About how you keep walking away like you're too good to speak to us. Bit rude, don't you think? Elena's eyes lifted to meet his, steady, unreadable. It's late, she said quietly. Let me pass. Graves laughed, low and controlled. Oh, we'll let you pass. Just want a quick chat first. His eyes flicked down her frame with a smirk. You know. Ramirez snickered. Chen's grin faltered. None of them noticed Elena's fingers make a small, barely perceptible motion, brushing the seam under her blouse where a micro body camera was clipped. A soft vibration answered. Recording engaged. Every word. Every movement. Every second. That's better, Graves said, stepping in until the wall was at Elena's back. See, Chief, you've been a little too quiet. Makes a guy wonder what you're hiding. Elena didn't answer. He leaned closer. Or who? Before he finished the last word, his hand shot forward. Not to grab, he wasn't foolish enough to leave marks, but to shove. Hard. The heel of his palm slammed into Elena's shoulder, forcing her against the metal wall with a sharp clang. For a split second, the corridor froze. Then everything moved. But it didn't move the way Graves expected. Elena let the impact travel through her body, not resisting, but absorbing it, turning linear force into rotational momentum. As his weight carried forward, she pivoted on the ball of her foot, sliding sideways and guiding his wrist into a narrow lock between radius and ulna. She didn't need strength, just physics. Graves' face snapped into surprise as the center of gravity vanished. Ramirez reacted exactly as she predicted. He lunged, expecting to grab her from the side while Graves crowded from the front. Elena stepped out of the attack line with a movement so small it barely qualified as a step. Her hand shot up, 2 fingers striking the notch high on his shoulder. A precise brachial plexus strike. Not flashy, not loud. But Ramirez's arm immediately went limp, hanging uselessly at his side as pain shot down his ribs. What the... he gasped, stumbling back. Chen panicked. There was no finesse as he rushed forward, trying to restrain Elena while also avoiding falling bodies. Elena didn't give him the chance. Still controlling Graves' wrist, she turned her hip just enough to redirect his weight. He staggered, legs tangling. The motion sent him crashing sideways into Chen, who wasn't ready for the full mass of a senior NCO slamming into him. Both men hit the ground hard. The entire sequence lasted less than 10 seconds. A blur of angles, balance, leverage. No punches thrown, no screams, no wasted movement. Ramirez clutched his dead arm, eyes wide. Chen groaned under Graves' weight. Graves himself was on hands and knees, stunned, trying to understand how the small warrant officer he'd mocked daily had dismantled them with the ease of someone who'd done it before. And far worse. Elena stood in the corridor's center, breathing steady. She adjusted her blouse where the shove had wrinkled it. Then she looked at them, calmly. Not angry, not boasting, just composed. This conversation is over, she said softly. She stepped past the 3 stunned men and walked away down the corridor, footsteps even and unhurried. Behind her, Graves stayed kneeling, pride cracked clean through. Ramirez tried lifting his lifeless arm. Chen rubbed the side of his head, dazed. They didn't shout after her, didn't threaten, didn't laugh. They just watched her walk away, their understanding of her and of themselves shifting like steel under heat. By sunrise, whispers drifted across Ironwood. Not loud, not certain. Just fragments of questions passed between soldiers and chow lines, mechanics changing tires, medics prepping kits. Did you hear what happened in the maintenance wing? 3 NCOs. 3. She didn't even raise her voice. What is she? What did she used to be? No one had answers. But everyone knew this. Elena Torres was no longer the quiet warrant officer in the corner. She was something else. Something the base had never taken time to see until it was too late. The hearing was called at 1400 hours. By the time everyone filed into the command conference room, the air felt dense enough to choke on. The walls were paneled in dark wood, making the space feel heavier, quieter, colder than the rest of Ironwood. A long table stretched through the center, papers neatly stacked, nameplates lined in a row. The flag hung behind the head chair. Colonel Vincent Cross occupied that chair like it had been forged for him. Stern, seasoned, carved from the kind of discipline most people only pretended to understand. His jaw was set, uniform immaculate, gaze sharp enough to quiet a room without uttering a sound. On one side sat Graves, Ramirez, and Chen, all in pressed service uniforms. They looked like 3 men trying very hard to appear wronged, calm, in control. Graves especially wore the expression of someone convinced he could talk his way out of anything. On the other side sat Chief Warrant Officer Elena Torres, hands folded, back straight, eyes steady. Commander Drake, her immediate superior, sat beside her. Cross opened the session with a clipped tone. Master Sergeant Graves, you requested this hearing. Proceed. Graves cleared his throat dramatically, playing to the room rather than the truth. Yes, sir, thank you. We're here because Chief Torres attacked me and my men in a maintenance corridor last night, unprovoked. We were checking a supply issue and well, she snapped. Came at us. We tried to de-escalate, but she was out of control. Ramirez nodded weakly, still cradling the arm she'd disabled. Chen echoed the gesture, staring at the table as if reliving trauma. Cross didn't react. He simply turned his eyes to Elena. Chief Torres, your response. Elena didn't launch into a defense. She didn't explain, justify, argue. She simply lifted one hand and gestured toward the folder in front of her. My report is complete, sir. That was all. Commander Drake spoke next, tone professional. Colonel, the report includes 2 pieces of evidence. With your permission, JAG will present them. Cross nodded once. The JAG officer, a calm man with wire-rimmed glasses, rose and approached the monitor on the far wall. He clicked a remote. The screen flickered to life. First exhibit, he said. Mess hall security footage from 3 days ago. The video played. Graves looming over Elena's table, shouting insults. The tray knocked to the floor. Elena standing silent, walking away. Not even the scrape of her chair betrayed emotion. The room held its breath. Ramirez and Chen shifted uncomfortably. Graves tried masking tension in his jaw, but the color creeping up his neck betrayed him. Cross's fingers tapped once against the table. Not a reaction, just acknowledgement. Jag clicked again. Second exhibit. Body-worn camera footage recorded by Chief Torres during last night's incident. Graves inhaled sharply. Elena didn't move. The screen lit up with the narrow metal corridor, the 3 men closing in, the shove, the pivot, the wrist lock. Ramirez's failed lunge and the precise nerve strike. Chen crashing into Graves under redirected force. 9 seconds. Clean, efficient, controlled. Not violent. Mastery. When the video ended, the silence was total. Cross leaned back slowly, studying Elena with recognition that came only from experience. A man who'd seen operators move like that before, in places where precision meant survival. He let the silence stretch. Let truth settle into the room like dust after an explosion. Finally, he spoke. Chief Torres, where did you learn control like that? Elena lifted her eyes to him, steady, unshaken. Sir, she said softly, I learned to do what was necessary to keep people alive. Nothing more, nothing less. And somehow that was louder than anything Graves had tried to claim. The sun had barely lifted over Ironwood when the loudspeakers crackled to life. A base-wide formation had been ordered, something that almost never happened unless the news was grave, historic, or both. Soldiers and Marines poured onto the parade ground, falling into rows with rigid precision. Boots stamped, murmurs traveled. Nobody knew details, but everyone felt the weight. Elena stood near the rear ranks of the Navy detachment, hands folded behind her back, eyes straight ahead. Her uniform was crisp, posture calm. If she felt anything, tension, dread, anticipation, none of it touched her face. At exactly 0800, Colonel Cross marched onto the platform. The field snapped to attention. At ease, he commanded, voice carrying across morning air. He stood with hands behind him, shoulders square, gaze sweeping the formation slowly. When he spoke next, his tone left no room for misinterpretation. In this uniform, we uphold honor, discipline, respect. And when those standards fail, when those who wear these ranks betray them, we correct it. Immediately, publicly, completely. A ripple went through the crowd. Last night, evidence was presented to this command. Evidence of misconduct, harassment, abuse of authority, and a deliberate attempt to conceal truth by 3 NCOs on this base. Eyes shifted toward Graves, Ramirez, Chen, standing rigidly in their formation's front row. All 3 were pale. Graves' jaw clenched so tight the muscle twitched. Cross continued. Effective immediately, Master Sergeant Tyler Graves is reduced in rank to Staff Sergeant. Sergeant First Class Ramirez and Staff Sergeant Chen are reduced to Sergeant. All 3 will forfeit 1 month's pay and are reassigned pending further review. Gasps whispered through the formation. Sharp, stunned. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was professional freefall. None of the three moved. And now, Cross said, tone shifting into something quieter, deeper, we address the final piece. He turned his head slightly. Chief Warrant Officer Elena Torres, front and center. Elena stepped forward from her detachment. One measured pace after another, shoulders steady, chin level. She moved through the corridor of uniforms like a calm tide cutting through stone. She reached the front and stopped exactly 2 paces from Colonel Cross. She rendered a crisp salute. Cross returned it with equal precision. Then he faced her fully, voice echoing across hundreds of listening service members. Chief Torres, on behalf of this base, this command, and the United States Marine Corps, I offer a formal apology for the misconduct committed against you. You showed restraint when others showed aggression, professionalism when others chose arrogance, strength when others displayed weakness. Silence wrapped around the field. He turned to Graves. Staff Sergeant Graves, step forward. Graves did, shoulders stiff, hands rigid at his sides. Humiliation radiated off him like heat. Cross's next words carved the moment into stone. Staff Sergeant, you will salute Chief Torres. For half a second, Graves didn't move. Not out of defiance, out of the crushing weight of what that order meant. A man who'd mocked her, belittled her, tried to break her, was now required to show the respect he once denied. Tension crackled across the parade ground. Then, slowly, very slowly, Graves's right hand rose. Fingers aligned. Palm cut the air. He executed a perfect salute. Sharp, controlled, but hollowed out by humiliation burning behind his eyes. A salute he never imagined giving to the woman he'd called worth nothing. Elena looked at him, not with triumph, not with vengeance, just quiet acknowledgement. She lifted her hand and returned the salute with the same calm precision she carried through every part of her life. In that moment, the entire formation understood something Graves never had. You cannot measure a warrior by volume, size, or swagger. Only by discipline. Only by character. Only by truth. When Elena lowered her hand, the silence that followed was profound. Not tension, respect. Hundreds of service members standing, humbled, reminded of what honor truly meant. Colonel Cross turned back to the formation. Let this stand as a reminder. Strength is not loud. Respect is not optional. And quiet warriors walk among us every day. No one moved. No one spoke. They just watched the small warrant officer standing at the parade ground's front, morning sun catching the edge of her uniform. No longer unseen. No longer underestimated. But still calm. Still humble. Still Elena Torres. Elena returned to the TOC just after 1100 hours. Morning sun was already heating metal rooftops outside, but inside the dimly lit comms bay, the air felt cooler, calmer. Screens glowed softly. Radios hummed with layered voices. Technicians moved between stations with usual focus. Except today, something was different. When Elena stepped through the doorway, conversations didn't stop. They softened. Heads didn't snap toward her. They simply turned. Quietly. Respectfully. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was the stillness that comes when people finally understand who they've been standing next to all along. She walked to her workstation with her usual steady pace, set her tablet down, signed into the system. A few soldiers nearby exchanged subtle glances. One young private, barely 19 and still growing into his uniform, swallowed and approached with hesitant steps.